North Carolina is used to thinking of itself as an economic powerhouse, as a leader in the New South, a leader in the Sun Belt economy, and that may have been true as late as the early 1990s. But it's not true anymore. And the reason I write this book is that North Carolina right now, as we speak, has one of the weakest economies in the United States. We have one of the worst records in unemployment, one of the worst records in per capita income growth, and we got to do something about it.
Let's talk about that, because you lay out essentially 4 major areas. The first one, the tax code. What is the reform plan?
We've got to do something about North Carolina's relatively high rate of tax on corporate investment. If you take into consideration the corporate income tax and the tax on corporate dividends or capital gains, North Carolina has one of the highest effective tax rates on investment, not just in the United States, but in the developed world. Most of the European countries, the Pacific Rim countries, have in the past dozen or so years reformed their tax codes. They've reduced the tax on dividends or capital gains, or reduced the tax on corporate income at the first place, or maybe both. And as a result, they have effective tax rates that are significantly lower than North Carolina's. And I'm not saying that all these other countries have lower overall taxes. They don't. Many of them have higher sales taxes than North Carolina. But where they outpace us is in the tax treatment of corporate investment, particularly the kinds of taxes that affect new businesses. New businesses that aren't going to be eligible for special tax giveaways or subsidies. New businesses that create the vast majority of net new jobs.
You also talk about regulation, and that's something that, John, I think a lot of people just kind of glaze over when you say the word regulation, but that's really, really important to economic recovery.
And it can be very costly. If you think about it this way, a tax is when the government forces you to surrender your money to the government. A regulation is when the government forces you to spend your money on something. The government doesn't ever actually get that money, so we don't see it on the budget. We don't see it as a revenue. But in many ways, these two acts are indistinguishable. They are telling you to do something with your money that you wouldn't otherwise have done. Now, because we're not anarchists, we don't believe that this practice is inherently wrong. There are some things that we're willing to tell people. You have to pay a certain amount of money, whether you like it or not, to cover the cost of courts and police and other public services. But you got to minimize that. North Carolina's not doing it, and that's part of our problem.